Certainly, thank you. I appreciate the invitation to be here and to enjoy the conference in Jeju Island. I'm Harold Tanner, and I'm a student of Chinese history, particularly modern Chinese history, and U.S.-China relations. And I'm the chair of the Department of History at the University of North Texas, where I've been teaching Chinese history and East Asian history and world history since 1997. The most imminent threat in East Asia is clearly the threat of conflict on the Korean Peninsula, because of the concerns about North Korea's nuclear developments and the tension between the United States and South Korea on the one hand, and the regime in Pyongyang on the other hand, and how this also relates to relations between the United States and China, South Korea and China, Japan and South Korea and the United States, and so on. So it's a very complicated relationship, and certainly the greatest threat in the center of attention recently is the North Korean issue. And so I would say certainly that's the greatest threat to the region. And what would be a reasonable approach to resolve this? If I knew the answer to that question, I would probably be in Washington right now. Well, let's look over what are the different possibilities. So you've raised two different possibilities. One is the resumption of the six-party talks. The second possibility you raised is the possibility of simply using military action, which would be a preemptive strike against North Korea. But there are other possibilities as well. If we think about this imaginatively, there is the possibility of, rather than the six-party talks, there's the possibility of the new South Korean president taking the initiative to open up different avenues, perhaps talks between South Korea and North Korea, perhaps on some level, not necessarily open, particularly at first, and then gradually bringing in the United States and China. That's one theoretical possibility. All right, I'm just talking about hypothetical theoretical possibilities here, and that we can imagine that being something that could happen, perhaps, that President Moon would take the initiative to start something which would gradually expand to bring in other actors. Another hypothetical possibility is for the United States and China to work together in order to bring North Korea to the table one way or the other. So now I have four possibilities, correct? Right? Six-party talks, a South Korean initiative, a Sino-American initiative, or nuclear or direct military action. What is the most realistic one? The simplest one is direct military action. It doesn't. That's very simple. Once you've decided to do it, the difficulty is in deciding to do it and understanding what the consequences would be, which would be, of course, disastrous and terrible and horrible and involve the deaths of huge numbers of people. So deciding to do that is very difficult, and rightly so. It shouldn't be easy to decide that, but it would be the easiest thing to do once you'd make the decision. But the implications and the aftermath would be horrendous. And it seems clear that everybody in the region and in the United States as well understands that the military option is not a realistic option. That the costs are too great. The cost in human life would be so tremendous as to be unbearable, and that a military option, therefore, although it would be simple to do, the United States could do it very quickly. Okay, but I think everybody understands that it is not a reasonable option and not a humane or moral option to take. And so that leaves us with the other options, correct? The six-party talks. Now, the six-party talks have been tried before, and I think it's probably very difficult to sell the parties, particularly the United States, into resuming them without any hope, any promise that things would be different. My impression is that people within the American State Department feel that the United States has talked with North Korea before and been deceived and has no reason to believe that North Korea would behave otherwise. And until the United States has a reason to believe that North Korea would behave in a straightforward and honest fashion, then the United States will probably not be willing to simply restart a six-party talks negotiations. That leaves us with the other two possibilities, right? One being what Donald Trump seems to be doing is to work with China in order to put pressure on North Korea to change something. If you remember that when Donald Trump, the presidential candidate, was on the campaign trail, he talked very harshly about possibly using military action against North Korea, and he talked very harshly about China. Candidate Trump accused China of being a currency manipulator, unfair trade practices, and so on and so forth. President Trump, very quickly after talking with Xi Jinping, turned around, began talking, dropping the issues of currency manipulation and other trade issues, and has praised Xi Jinping for helping out on the Korean issue. And of course, China has taken a few steps, right, particularly with regard to the coal imports and criticisms of North Korea's missile tests and nuclear tests. And Donald Trump has been praising Xi Jinping and saying China's helping us out, China's being, and at one point somebody challenged Donald Trump and said, well, why aren't you talking about currency manipulation? He said, I don't want to talk about that right now. Why talk about that when China is helping us out with North Korea? That would be counterproductive. Donald Trump is a transactional person. He wants to do deals. And putting currency manipulation aside is part of the deal that he's making with North Korea. With China. So perhaps that avenue will lead to something we don't know. But perhaps that interaction between the United States and China will lead to North Korea. North Korea needs to give up something in order for the United States to talk to North Korea in any format, whether it's direct talks, which seem very, very unlikely, or talks within something structured like the six-party talks or some new structure of multilateral talks. North Korea has to give Donald Trump something. Otherwise, he cannot justify dealing with Kim Jong-un. So perhaps the China connection will come up with something in which North Korea takes a step backwards, takes a step down, and de-escalates, does something to give Donald Trump the off-ramp, if you like, the highway exit, to take that exit to go towards the point of talks. But maybe that won't work. Not every deal that Donald Trump makes is a success. Some of Donald Trump's business deals were failures. Maybe certainly some of his foreign policy deals will be failures. What if China doesn't deliver? Then what will happen with this deal? We'll be back to square one, won't we? And now the final possibility that I raised is President Moon taking some initiatives and engaging North Korea in some way. And then developing from there, bringing the United States into some multilateral engagement. And so that is also a possibility. Which is the most likely of these possibilities? Perhaps actually the South Korean President Moon taking the initiative and bringing something that both requires and enables the American administration to take a further step. Perhaps similar to the Sunshine Policy. But again, this would involve the President Moon being able to do that, given his domestic political concerns, and it would require then Donald Trump. It would require President Moon and the North Koreans to do something that would be big enough and significant enough for Donald Trump then to become involved, for Trump to talk with North Korea. Some specialists have suggested that the United States should simply accept that North Korea is, the regime is there, recognize it diplomatically, accept that this regime is going to be there and that we probably can't do anything about its pursuit of nuclear weapons, and start living with it. But that's something that's very difficult for any American president to say, whether Democratic or Republican. This is an extension of the question we just dealt with, isn't it?
Right.
The position of South Korea in the midst of the two superpowers, which are adversaries. So let's return a little bit to that context of the adversarial relationship between China and the United States. And there are different aspects of that adversarial relationship. There's an economic relationship between the United States and China, which is ambiguous. It has an adversarial relationship, but it also has a very deep cooperative relationship. American companies are very deeply invested in China and make a lot of money by doing business in China and manufacturing things in China and exporting them to the United States. Not only China makes money, American companies make huge amounts of money too, and American consumers benefit by buying cheaply made Chinese goods. But then there's also the trade frictions and the so-called trade imbalances and debates about that. So there's the economic aspect of this adversarial relationship. But the economic aspect also has an integrative side to it, in which the two sides really need each other. And that's one thing for all parties, including South Korea, to consider, is that although they are adversaries, China and the United States also are very closely tied in with each other and cannot simply say, we're mad at you, we're going away. Donald Trump may talk about protectionism, but he will not be able to actually put his protectionist policies fully into practice. Peter Navarro, who was one of Donald Trump's advisors, was talking about huge, what I think it said 37 or 47% tariffs should be imposed on all Chinese goods. Nobody's talking about that anymore. Okay? Because it would absolutely kill American companies. And so it's important for South Korea, as well as others in the region, and for the Americans and the Chinese, to remember that although the relationship economically is adversarial, it is also cooperative, and both countries need each other. Which means that since they both need each other, there's limits to what they can do in terms of pushing each other on the other adversarial issues. Now, the other adversarial aspects of the of the China-U.S. relationship are the Taiwan issue and the South China Sea issue. Those are the two main ones. And let's take the Taiwan issue first, which is that the United States and China have agreed to disagree on that and to continue kicking the can down the road and delaying any resolution of the issue. And Donald Trump seems to be continuing with that policy. The other one is the South China Sea issue. And on the South China Sea issue, those territorial disputes, the United States is concerned mostly about freedom of navigation. And with preventing China and using this as a way of preventing China from being too powerful in the region. These are issues also that can be resolved because the United States, for instance, does not claim any of the islands or reefs. And the United States' position on if the Philippines and China have a dispute about them, the United States is going to say, well, we don't care, we don't take a position on who owns these, we would prefer that you just negotiate it and resolve it peacefully. And Donald Trump has been actually soft-pedaling and backing off on the South China Sea issue as well, because he wants China's cooperation not only on trade but also on North Korea. So given that the United States and China have both adversarial and cooperative relationships, then return to the issue of South Korea and the deployment of the THAAD missiles. The question of whether or not is this missile system conducive to the national security of South Korea? Is it something that South Korea really needs? I really would rather leave that question to a weapons specialist than to myself. I don't play with nuclear weapons or deal with missile technology on a regular basis. Clearly, South Korea has a lot to be worried about, not only from the possibility of North Korea's further nuclear development of its nuclear capabilities, but from conventional missile systems. And so whether it is THAAD or some other defensive system, South Korea's defense, practically speaking, does need some sort of way of dealing with the possibility of conventional missile strikes on Seoul. And my question would be, if we say THAAD is not that system, then what is? What is the best way for South Korea to protect itself against the threat, and it is a real threat, of missile attacks from North Korea? Is there a better way? If South Korea simply did not have this system at all and the United States did not deploy this system, would that actually make a diplomatic resolution easier? That's a very complicated question. I don't really have a very good answer for that, because I'm not a specialist in weapons systems. I think it's clear that the entire issue has become an issue not only of South Korea but also of the United States and China, and South Korea as perhaps too often is sometimes a pawn in the game. Well, let's begin with Sino-American relations. Do they face a turning point?
Is that true? Do you agree?
Do I agree that Sino-American relations face a turning point? No, I don't see a turning point.
Why?
I don't see a turning point because at the present we don't see what Donald Trump really intends to do. For there to be a turning point, the United States needs to have a policy to turn something new to turn to. The Obama administration had the so-called pivot or rebalance, depending on which phrase they wanted to use, and they started with pivot and then moved to rebalance because it sounded a little less military and a little bit less threatening. So the Obama administration's rebalance was that didn't really represent a significant turning point either. It simply was a little more emphasis on East Asia, but it didn't really substantially change the relationship with China. So no, I don't see there's a turning point in the relations with China at this particular moment. The American relationship with China has been for the past, since the Cold War, since the end of the Cold War. It's been a relationship which is characterized by a combination of adversarial and cooperative relationships, an ambiguous relationship, in other words. During the Cold War, the the U.S.-China relationship had a foundation, and that foundation was a common enmity toward the Soviet Union. That's why Nixon and Kissinger made a rapprochement to China, and that's why Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai were willing to deal with Nixon and Kissinger. Both sides had a common enemy in the Cold War, and there was a strong foundation in a very simple, clear mutual interest. It wasn't an economic interest. It wasn't a social interest. It was a political interest. It was simply a geostrategic interest in countering the Soviet Union. And Nixon and Kissinger didn't care about human rights. They didn't care that much about Taiwan either, honestly. They wanted to counter the Soviet Union, and they wanted to get the United States out of Vietnam. And they achieved their goal. Right? After the Cold War, then the question is, what is this relationship founded on? What's the foundation of the United States relationship with China when you don't have that common enemy? And to a degree, the relationship became much more complicated with the end of the Cold War. Because with the end of the Cold War, first of all, much more so than previously, the United States was more willing to put human rights in the foreground. It did so to some degree during the Cold War, particularly under the Carter administration. But with the end of the Cold War, the relationship became more complicated because that foundation wasn't there. And the relationship became more ambiguous. On the one hand, the competition, the criticism of China on human rights issues, for example, and on the other hand, the deep business ties. And as the post-Cold War era has progressed, the relationship has become more and more complicated as China's economic and military power have grown. Back in the 1980s, the United States didn't see China as a threat. Now the United States sees China as a threat. China sees China as threatening to be a competitor with the United States on a regional basis and in the Pacific, and concerned about China's increasing maritime power. So that concern starts well before Donald Trump and continues. So I don't see that. Again, I'm returning to I do not see a turning point right now in Sino-American relations. I simply see a continuation of this ambiguous relationship which doesn't have a solid foundation instead has certain adversarial aspect to it and a cooperative aspect to it. Second, I was saying that you can't have a turning point unless Donald Trump has a policy to turn to. And it's not clear yet that Donald Trump has a policy to turn to. Donald Trump does not have a complete contingent of East Asia advisors. He hasn't fully staffed the State Department, and particularly on the East Asia side. There are a number of people who are working in the East Asia area, either have been in the State Department or have experience, who have not been hired and whom Donald Trump and his administration seem not interested in hiring. There are also experts on the Korean Peninsula who have worked for previous administrations but simply are not working for the Trump administration for one reason or another. And so without this, without a stable of expertise, without a pool of talent who are going to devise a new policy, there's no new policy to turn to. And you'll simply get a continuation of ad hoc, whatever Donald Trump and thinks at the moment, or whatever advisor who is not a specialist in the region kind of got to him and kind of convinced him of on one particular day or another. He'll continue going back and forth and not having a stable, coherent, well thought out strategy or policy for East Asia. So again, there's a reason why I say I don't see a pivot, a turning point in U.S.-China relationships. Now, the economic order of East Asia, there you do see a distinct difference in that the Obama administration had been pursuing the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, right? And Donald Trump, on the campaign trail, criticized the TPP. Ironically, one of the things that Trump said about the TPP was that it was something that was good for China, which is absolutely not the case. The TPP was designed to have an American leadership over an East Asian over a Trans-Pacific economic structure, and to put China on the outside of that structure. So that kind of indicated Donald Trump's lack of understanding. But what Donald Trump did understand was that the American public doesn't like the TPP. So he scrapped it, right? And he said, well, the United States is not going to become involved. This, of course, makes it possible for China to take the lead. It makes it possible for China to take over the mantle of being a proponent of globalization. It allows Xi Jinping to go to Davos and make his speech, and very ironically, for the leader of a power when China does not have an open market, it is in some ways highly protectionist itself. It does not respect intellectual property rights and has many other different problems in terms of market access and so on and so forth. So Xi Jinping standing in Davos talking about globalization and openness, and it was very ironic, but Donald Trump allowed him to do that. Donald Trump's pulling out of the TPP enabled China to take the lead. And so this is a difference. And that means if there is the future economic order in East Asia will now be a kind of a competition between the United States and China on different grounds than it would have been. Because when the TPP was there, the United States was putting together a series of a partnership with the other regions other than China, other nations other than China in the region, and now that framework has had the rug pulled out from under it. So what will happen? What is the future of the economic order in East Asia? One possibility would be for China to become more dominant, and clearly that's what China hopes. And that's certainly a distinct possibility that with American leadership out of the region, that China will be able to exercise its power, both its economic power and its soft power, to bring more countries in the region into its structure. And China will start to design the architecture of an East Asian economy, which will be China-centered. But at the same time, it seems likely that the United States will continue to pursue bilateral and perhaps multilateral agreements and negotiations, renegotiating existing deals, negotiating new deals. We need to remember that the reason the United States was in the TPP in the first place is that American businesses saw tremendous advantages to it. And those American businesses will still see advantages and still want to be in the East Asian markets. And they still want trade agreements. And so those businesses, those American businesses, are going to be pushing the Trump White House to make deals that will get them what the TPP was going to get them. Those American businesses still want what TPP was going to give them, and they're going to try to get it by some other means, if that's possible. Some very optimistic people have said, well, maybe what Donald Trump will do eventually is to start putting these pieces back together and negotiate something that will be like the TPP, but he can't call it that because if you call it that, the American public won't accept it. So there's still a possibility of American leadership, but it will have to be an American leadership that is built, that somehow is rebuilt on the wreckage of the TPP. And whether Donald Trump's administration is capable and willing to do that and capable of doing that remains to be seen. Another part of your question was about Donald Trump's protectionism. You've asked, will Donald Trump's protectionism reinvigorate the American economy? First of all, I don't think that Donald Trump will be able to implement all of his protectionist policies. Donald Trump's protectionist agenda was not based on a realistic reading of the economic situation. It was campaign rhetoric. It was rhetoric designed to appeal to people who don't know any better. And American businesses do not want protectionism. American businesses have benefited tremendously from globalization. And I'm returning to the point I just made, I think, that American businesses have a lot invested in globalization, and they are not going to easily allow the United States government to institute a huge number of protectionist policies. And so if Donald Trump does pursue protectionism, it will not be the complete package that he has imagined. The reality is once things hit Congress, whatever Donald Trump can do by executive order, maybe he can do, but there's a limit to what he can do. He needs to deal with businesses, he needs to deal with Congress, and when he does, then that protectionist policy, that protectionist agenda will be watered down. So that's one part of your question, why won't protectionism reinvigorate the American economy? Because the protectionist agenda will not be fully implemented. And because it's not designed to reinvigorate the American economy anyway. The second reason is that a lot of this protectionism really won't do any good for the American economy. A lot of the changes in the American economy are due to things other than international competition. The coal industry and the fossil fuel industry, for example, that's going to decline anyway. That's been declining. It's going to continue to decline because coal is just not the most efficient means of generating power anymore. Other industries, jobs that have been, to some degree, certainly jobs have been taken away from the American economy and outsourced to China or other countries, and they won't come back to the American economy until it's cheaper to make that stuff in America. And if protectionist measures make it too expensive to produce A, B, and C in China, then the American companies that are doing that will say, well, where is it cheaper? Vietnam? Laos, Cambodia, they'll find somewhere else. Also, of course, it might be cheaper to bring some of that production back to the United States and do it via automation and robots rather than paid human workers. So in that respect, too, protectionism is not going to bring back American jobs that were lost. American industrial jobs were being lost ever since World War II. It's been a decline. And they're going to continue to decline because of really fundamental structure changes in production and trade, not just because of globalization. And so protectionism is not going to change that. You asked again, will Japan recover from this lost decade of the Japanese economy? I think that will be very difficult. I think that the demographics of Japan still aren't in their favor. And so I think Vladimir Putin will continue to do that, and will Russia emphasize the Far Eastern region? I think probably Russia will put more emphasis on the Far Eastern region, but Russia at the same time has its Far Western regions to be concerned with. And so Russia cannot afford to focus solely on one or the other. But Russia will also be interested in emphasizing its eastern region because Russia may want to weaken American influence in the region, But in the long term, Russia will also have to deal with the possibility of Chinese influence, and Russia and China will not always be friends. They may be allies of convenience in weakening the United States, but after supposing if they accomplish that goal, then they will be enemies because their natural, the contradictions between them and the conflicts of interest between them will reemerge. And some of those conflicts of interest have to do with Russia's Far East, which the Chinese will perhaps tell you was part of China at one time, part of the Qing Empire. So there's every reason for China to be interested in that area as well. Well, I thank you for your hospitality and for all the interesting questions. I've enjoyed my short time on Jeju Island and would hope to visit again, and again appreciate the invitation to be here and the generosity of the organizers of the event and in putting this together and inviting me. I'm really honored to be here and hope to return